Architecture after information scarcity, physical experience in the era of abundance is the name of my talk. And this lecture starts with a simple observation, which is a lot of the things that architects have traditionally spent huge amounts of time producing have gotten and are continuing to get much easier to produce. So drawings, renderings, iterations, design, documentation. You can think of all of this as a layer of information. And for a long time, architects have been hired because this information was necessary, it was scarce, and it was difficult to produce. And an architect's fee was tied to our ability to create, coordinate, and deliver this information. But we're living through a moment of technological change, and a lot of this work is becoming faster, cheaper, and more automated. So I want to start with a basic question, which is, what is architecture really? And what is the architect's role once this information is no longer scarce? For most of architectural history, the architect has been an information worker. Architects don't make buildings. We make the information that tells other people how to make buildings. Drawings, specifications, instructions, coordination, representation. For most of our profession's history, this information was scarce. It was hard to produce, hard to revise, hard to communicate. Drawings take time, renderings take skill and labor, and iteration was slow. So a large part of the architect's value came from our ability to create, organize, and transmit design information. This is what I'm referring to when I refer to the information layer of architecture. Then our tools changed. We moved from drafting tables to computers, from trace paper to screens, from hand drawing to CAD and BIM and the other software that we take for granted. And that felt like a major transformation, and in some ways it was, but underneath all of that, our role is surprisingly similar to how it used to be. The interface that we use changed, but the architects are still information workers. Our profession rewards people who can take a really messy set of constraints and turn them into a clear design proposal. A site, a brief, a budget, a program, structure, code, technical limits, real-world demands, client relationships. We have to hold all of this at once, make sense of it, and shape it into something that's coherent and buildable. Then this proposal has to be translated into a set of drawings, and those drawings are information that gets passed on to the client and the builder. So a big part of architectural value is tied to our ability to synthesize complexity and to communicate it clearly. But now we're entering a new shift. We're moving from scarcity to what I think of as abundance, from iterations being very expensive to very cheap and quick iteration, from limited options to endless options. And I believe that this matters because the value of architectural information starts to collapse if it is no longer scarce or difficult to produce. So our drawings, renderings, formatting, code support, precedent search, design iterations, more and more of this is becoming a lot easier to generate. And I think this technology is still early, but the direction is very obvious. We can already see where this is going. It's not hard to imagine a near future scenario where somebody uploads a brief, a site, a budget, a set of code constraints, and then an AI system can generate a full set of drawings in minutes, if not seconds. All of the friction that has existed in the information layer of architecture is being erased. So what happens when somebody with zero training can generate buildable, code-compliant set of construction drawings? I don't think this is science fiction. I believe this is the direction we're moving in, and I frankly don't think there's anything we can do to stop it. So the question I want to ask is not how to resist it, But I'm more interested in how do we understand this shift? How do we make sense of it? And how does it redefine our role as professionals? And there's an important clarification here. I'm not saying that we have to reject these tools. I actually think, or pretend that they're not useful. I think it's our responsibility to learn how to use them. And I really think we stand to benefit from getting good at using them. But at the same time, we have to reframe the value that we bring as architects. The tools that I'm talking about can help produce information. They can help accelerate our process, but they don't remove the responsibility of making real space. They're still just tools. Think of a very fancy pencil. I think the deeper question is, what kind of judgment should we be using to guide the use of these tools, and what kind of architecture comes out of that? So if architectural information becomes cheap, what remains valuable? I think the answer is judgment. Scarcity is no longer in ideas or representation or documentation. The new scarcity is conviction, execution, and the ability to deal with reality. When variation is cheap, judgment becomes expensive. The bottleneck is no longer just imagination, it's discernment, deciding what deserves to exist physically and how it should take form in the world. And I think that points to something deeper, which is that maybe architecture was never primarily about information to begin with. Maybe our role in managing complex information was just an accident of necessity. And I think that as soon as some of this burden gets lifted, we can be freed to focus on something even more fundamental to our profession. Before going any further, I think we should pause and ask a question, a basic question. Before we ask what the architect's role becomes, I think we should ask what architecture really is. Because if we get that wrong, then everything that follows is built on the wrong assumption. So my question is very simple. What is architecture? A drawing is not architecture. It's an instruction for architecture. A rendering is not architecture. It's an approximation of architecture at best. A model is not architecture, also a representation of architecture. A photograph is not architecture. A photograph is a record of architecture. And even a building by itself is just a physical object. Architecture isn't the image of a building, or the drawing of a building, or the model of a building, or the photo of a building. And I would even argue that architecture is not exactly the same thing as the building object itself. So if architecture is not any of these things on their own, then where does it actually live? I think architecture begins here. Architecture is a physical encounter. It happens when matter, light, scale, and sequence act on our bodies. It acts on us through light, weight, temperature, sound, texture, resistance, and time. In other words, architecture is not something that you understand all at once from a distance as an image. It's something you move through, something you feel, something that unfolds. The real side of architecture is the body in space. We experience architecture through movement, posture, proximity, compression, release, orientation, and atmosphere. This is where architecture is real. So if the information layer becomes abundant, what remains irreducible? What cannot be reduced to data or fully captured by representation alone? I think the answer is experience. Threshold, tactility, atmosphere, weathering, gravity, silence, orientation, thermal experience, time. These things aren't just aesthetic effects, they are conditions of physical presence and sensory perception. They cannot be fully captured by an image, no matter how convincing that image is. They have to be encountered, they have to be felt, they have to be made real through the meeting of a body and a building. The site of architecture is, was, and will always be the human body. So the real work of the architect is not just creating and managing information. Our responsibility is deeper. older, harder to automate, and maybe more meaningful. Architecture is one of the oldest human arts. We take inert matter, stone, wood, metal, earth, water, light, and we turn it into something felt. That transformation, I believe, is alchemy. The fact that physical materials, assembled with care and judgment, can alter consciousness, emotion, behavior, and memory is one of the great facts of human life. We arrange matter, and in doing so, we change experience. We shape enclosure, proportion, sequence, texture, and light, and somehow those decisions that we make in another person become calmness or tension or reverence, intimacy, awe. This is part of what makes architecture so strange and so powerful. It is at once practical and mysterious. We must satisfy structure, budget, program code, gravity, weather, labor, and time. Yet out of those constraints, we can still produce something immeasurable. A room can make you more alert. A corridor can heighten anticipation. A stair can slow you down. A wall can make you feel protected. A courtyard can make you breathe differently. Architecture is never only shelter. It is also atmosphere, orientation, ritual, memory, and mood made physical. And even as we move deeper into digital life, even as more and more of our world becomes frictionless, simulated, abstract, and weightless, we need this experiential dimension of reality more, not less. We need places that return us to our bodies, places that remind us that we are physical beings living in time, places that interrupt the soft hypnosis of screens and reintroduce us to scale, distance, temperature, resistance, and presence. A lot of contemporary life encourages disembodiment. We scroll, swipe, stream, simulate, and optimize. We spend more and more time in environments where friction is treated as a problem to be eliminated. But architecture cannot be understood in those terms because architecture works precisely through friction, through thickness, through weight, through limits, through the fact that your body has size, that light changes by the hour, that materials age, that sound reverberates differently in stone than in wood, that heat gathers, that shadows deepen, and that every active movement through space is real and irreversible. Great architecture is not just something that you look at, it's something that you register with your entire body. The roughness of stone under the hand, the coolness of metal against the skin, the weight of a wall, the hush of a room, the smell of timber, the glare of late afternoon sun on the floor, the way light moves across a surface and tells you, without language, that time is passing, the slight echo in a vaulted space, the compression of a narrow passage before a room opens, the warmth held in a bench that has been sitting in the sun, the darkening of a threshold that prepares you to enter. The most important things architecture does are often the hardest to design, anticipate, and communicate, not because they're vague, but because they're embodied. These aren't moments that arrive as concepts first, they actually arrive as sensations, as adjustments, as shifts in awareness, and they happen before language used to describe them can catch up. You do not experience a building all at once. You approach it, you cross into it, your eyes adjust, your pace changes, the floor sounds different under your feet, the air cools, a wall catches light, your hand touches a handrail polished by years of contact, a room lowers your voice without asking. Maybe that is one of the simplest ways to say what architecture is. It is the shaping of conditions that alter the body and organize attention. This is the territory that architecture still owns. If architecture is not defined as a set of information that describes its making, then where does the deeper value live? The value of architecture lives in the things that are hardest to flatten, in crossing thresholds, in light, in contact, in silence, in heat, in time. Architecture begins before the room. Architecture begins in the approach, in anticipation, in the subtle preparation of the body, in the slowing that happens before arrival, in the moment you leave one condition and enter another. That path matters, the stair matters, the wall you move alongside matters, the narrowing of a passage matters, the thickening of a doorway matters. These aren't neutral transitions, they shape your expectation. A threshold isn't just a line in a plan, it's a change in pressure, pace, light, and awareness. A threshold is the moment where architecture tells your body that something is about to change. You were outside, now you're inside. You were in noise, now you are in quiet. You were in exposure, now you are in shelter. A good threshold isn't crossed, it's felt. And then space begins to orient you, not only through geometry, but through light, through shadow, through the height of a ceiling, the depth of a wall, the brightness of an opening, the glow of a surface receiving the sun. Light isn't something that you add to architecture. It is one of the ways that architecture becomes perceptible. It reveals thickness, it reveals depth, it reveals edge, texture, form, and time. It turns a static room into a changing event. A rendering can imitate light, but a building actually holds light. Your body is what perceives the light, and that difference matters. Real light has duration, it moves, it fades, it surprises, it carries weathers, seasons, hours, and atmosphere into the life of a building. And it's never exactly the same twice. Then there's physical contact, the way a material receives light, the way it absorbs heat, the way it resists the hand, the way it measures reality, the way two materials meet and reveal whether a detail was actually thought through. Joints matter, edges matter, corners matter, a handrail matters. A floor meeting a wall matters. These small moments aren't secondary to architecture. They're often it's where architecture declares its seriousness. And materials are not just visual effects, they're physical realities. They have a temperature, a texture, a density, a weight, an age. Wood is not interchangeable with stone. Stone is not interchangeable with concrete. Concrete is not interchangeable with plaster. And even when they might look similar in a photograph, they don't behave the same way in the world. They hold light differently, they hold heat differently, they weather differently, they break differently. They ask different things of the hand, the foot, the ear, and the eye. Some spaces will tune your body without announcing how they do it. They slow you down, they lower your voice, they sharpen your hearing, they heighten your awareness of your own movement, and they make you notice the distance between things. They invite stillness. They make silence feel present rather than empty. Other spaces can quicken you, they can pull you forward, heighten your alertness. They make your body feel more awake, more upright, more charged. They sharpen anticipation, they increase tempo. They can energize, unsettle, exhilarate, even provoke. Architecture doesn't only calm, it can also intensify. It can gather momentum in the body and direct it. Atmosphere is not a mood that gets laid on top of architecture. It is the emotional result of proportion, enclosure, shadow, sound, material, and restraint. Atmosphere is not decoration. It's the consequence of hundreds of decisions and accidents. A room feels solemn, intimate, calm, heavy, open, or charged as a result of the clarity of architectural intent behind its making. Through scale, thickness, rhythm, texture, and light, atmosphere is what happens when matter is arranged with enough precision that it begins to affect the inner life of the person inside it. And architecture is not finished when construction ends. In some sense, that's when it begins, because before that, it is still mostly just intention, still mostly projection or promise. But then life touches it. Buildings darken, they soften, stain, wear, and gather evidence of life. They hold heat, they release coolness, they register weather, use, neglect, ritual, and return. Edges get rounded off, Metal oxidizes, stone is polished by hands and feet, timber dries and deepens, moss appears, water leaves marks, sun bleaches one surface and leaves another one in shadow, and time moves across architecture and either reveals the depth of the architecture or it exposes its emptiness. All of this matters because so much of architectural culture now lives in the before image, the rendering or a visualization or a perfectly lit promise of a building that's not touched by weather or cost cutting or maintenance or occupation or age. But architecture doesn't live there. Architecture lives in the after, in use, in repetition, in endurance, in adaptation, in all of the ways that a building meets the world and either grows more powerful or falls apart. A rendering can show us perfection, but it can't show us a building entering time. Maybe this all points to a larger shift. What is being driven towards zero is not only the image, it is the entire informational layer of architecture. Our drawings, renderings, compliance checks, coordination, structural calculations, documentation, modeling, management, all of this data that describes and predicts and organizes and transmits a building, this is all becoming cheaper, faster, and more automated. And as the barriers fall around the production of architectural information, I think that the deepest value of architecture doesn't disappear. It just returns to where it's always been. Because information, I'm not saying information doesn't matter. It does. And I'm not saying that drawings are irrelevant, because they're definitely not. But none of these things are architecture itself. These are all descriptions of architecture, instructions for architecture, approximations of architecture. But real architecture ultimately has to pass a harder test. It has to become real. It has to meet gravity, weather, touch, sound, use, and duration. It has to meet the body. And these things are not decorative extras. They're not secondary layers that you apply after the concept is finished. What I'm describing is the substance of architecture. It's what architecture really is. And it's precisely this territory that I think becomes more valuable as information becomes less scarce and easier to commoditize. So what does all of this mean for our practice and for our education? If architecture is fundamentally a bodily and sensory art, then the architect's role starts to become clearer in this new landscape. I think the architect becomes less of an image maker and less of a form stylist, and become more of a choreographer of physical experience, more of an editor of what truly deserves to be built, and more of a judge of what should exist physically in the first place. The question is no longer just, can we imagine this thing? The question is, should this be built? And I don't think this is a reduction of our profession. I actually think this is a clarification of what we do. Because as architectural information gets cheaper to make, then I think that real spatial and sensory depth becomes a lot more valuable. Because in that sense, the shallowest layer of the profession is getting automated, which allows the deeper layer to come back into view. I actually think this opens up a better version of the profession. The role of the architect changes. We become less of a technician of documentation, less a manager of information, and we become more of a judge, an editor, an orchestrator, more of a custodian of what deserves to become real. In that sense, the architect becomes somebody who decides what should and should not come into existence, less like a drafting technician and more like an orchestrator of physical experience. So what should you cultivate now as students? It's not about having less skill, but I think it's about having a different kind of depth, which involves observation, sensory precision, material intuition, patience, judgment, and reverence for construction and for sight. You should learn to ask questions like, what does this room do to the body? Why do some spaces stay with you and others do not? What does light do here at a certain hour? How do materials respond to sun, shadow, heat, moisture, and age? What is different about being in a building versus seeing an image of it? In practical terms, that means drawing from life, visiting buildings, paying attention to your sensory memories, testing out materials physically, focusing on what architecture does, not just what it looks like. I think these are the fundamentals that are becoming more and more important, not less. This is embodied intelligence, it's discernment, it's the reality of construction, it's the difference between visual novelty and spatial depth. I think that the future architect won't win by making more images, but by facilitating experiences that matter to us more. AI is able to expand what is possible in the realm of information. It can help us generate options, speed up our process, and widen the field. But what it cannot replace is our responsibility to judge, shape, and bring into the world physical situations that matter. Buildings are not representations. Buildings are physical situations that act on bodies over time. That's why architecture matters, and that's why the architect still matters. So maybe this is the question that I want to leave you with. What is worth building? I think this is the question that you will be asking yourselves throughout your career more and more. Not just, is this code compliant, or does this plan match this section, or does this drawing coordinate with that detail? Because more and more of those kinds of questions will be handled for you. But this question, what is worth building, is the question that will remain. We're entering a world where architecture's informational output can be generated and optimized and automated, but that doesn't make architecture less important. It makes our deeper purpose easier to see. In the age of infinite design, architecture returns to what it has always been, which is the shaping of physical experiences. And that becomes, and the more abundant that information becomes, the more precious reality becomes. Thank you.